In this video, we talk about figured bass. Throughout musical history, cultures have developed different methods for musical shorthand. This just means shortcuts to writing down the music that's in our brains and in our hands. For instance, jazz musicians are familiar with lead sheets that have the music for a tune's melody with the chords that can harmonize it. So if you're learning, say, What a Wonderful World, you might have the melody, which I played a little bit wrong there, sorry, and the chords that come underneath it. Now, during the Baroque era, this was reversed. The accepted musical shorthand was known as figured bass, and in this case, we would have a bass line, and then we'd realize the chords above it. The basso continuo, which was a sort of Baroque rhythm section made up of a chordal instrument, so an instrument that can play chords like a harpsichord, organ, or lute, or sometimes even guitar, plus a bass line instrument like a bassoon, bass viol, or cello would perform these parts. So a basso continuo actually would consist of, most of the time, at least two instruments. Chordal instruments would read from the bass line, as we see at the right-hand side, an excerpt from Mozart's Requiem, and they would use the figures, or the numbers, written beneath it, and then they would realize the chords above. They'd fill in the chordal notes. So we see here that Mozart, the bass line that Mozart writes is that 7 and the sharp mean that he wants a G sharp and a D above that harmony, and the B is implied, so he wants a 5-7 chord in A minor, and then to resolve to an A minor chord, and then an E with a 4 suspension, then moving to the G sharp, and then an A minor chord. So it sounds something like this. And that's what basso continuo keyboardists would be used to reading, and they could do it very quickly with minimal amounts of practice, because that's sort of the acceptable musical shorthand for that culture. So let's talk about what these figures, or the numbers, mean. These figures indicate intervals above the bass voice, which intervals above the bass voice should be played. And it's important to remember that when realized, these intervals could be displaced an octave from the exact interval specified. So if you have a really low note, like let's say a very low C, and you have a 6 that's written underneath that note, it doesn't mean that it has to be exactly a sixth above that C. It could be a sixth plus an octave, or a sixth plus 2 octaves. More precisely, what those figures are indicating are the pitch class that should be heard somewhere in the chord, rather than the specific pitch. So it could be any A, not just a specific A. So if you have a C and then a 6 above it, that could imply that you want a first inversion A minor chord, and that A minor chord could be voiced almost any way you choose. There are some stylistic guidelines, but almost any way you choose, as long as we have those pitches in the chord. Something like that. Certain intervals are so common that they might be left off. Think about life before music notation software and laser printers and copiers and iPads and e-readers and everything like that. It took a long time to copy out scores, and it was in the composer's best interest to dash off their music as quickly and as legibly as possible. So oftentimes there would be figures or numbers that would be omitted. For instance, the 6 in second and third inversion 7th chords, the 5th in root position triads and root position 7th chords, and the 3 in root position triads and 7th chords, and first inversion triads and 7th chords. Now, I want to emphasize that it's the figure that's omitted, not the chord member. The point is that these intervals are so common that sometimes they would just be left off of the figuration, knowing, and the player would know from the other context that they should be there. Now, don't worry too much about this, because we'll see that figured bass figuration is going to be very similar to the types of figures that we use to indicate inversions in Roman numeral analysis, which is exactly where we get that analytical process from. So let's talk about these figures. When you see a blank above a note, you don't have to see those brackets, that's just indicating there's a blank there. But when you see a blank above a note, it indicates a root position triad. So the blank means that the 5 and the 3 are assumed. It doesn't just mean have the one note, it means give a third and a fifth above that. And again, it doesn't have to be just an exact third or a fifth. It could be an octave and a third, or an octave and a fifth. And you could even double the root, that would be fine. A 6 indicates a chord in first inversion. In this case, the root is a sixth above the bass. That's why we have that 6 there, and why we put a 6 next to first inversion chords. In this case, the 3 is assumed. We still want to have a third above the bass there, but it's just assumed that that's going to be there for this shorthand. A 6-4 indicates a chord in second inversion, so you'll have a sixth above the bass and a fourth above the bass. If you have a 7, you'll see that that indicates a seventh chord in root position. Here, the 5 and the 3 are assumed. A 6-5 indicates a seventh chord in first inversion, and the 3 is assumed. With a 4 and a 3, this indicates a seventh chord in second inversion. Here, the 6 is assumed. And with a 4-2, this indicates a seventh chord in third inversion. Here, the 6 is assumed. Now, you'll notice that these are the exact inversion symbols that we use for Roman numeral analysis. So you can kind of work backwards if you're still feeling uncertain about how to read figured bass. It takes a while, and you still have to work at it. But if you're feeling uncertain about it, you can take the bass note and see that the figuration symbol that's underneath it. And you can reverse engineer it. You can think backwards. So you can say, well, there's a C in the bass, and it says 4-2 in the figures. That means this is a seventh chord in third inversion. And you can think to yourself, what chord has a C as the seventh? Because the C would have to be the seventh for it to be in the bass if it's in third inversion. And you could think, well, if C is the seventh, then it's going to be A, F, D underneath it. Well, there we go. It's a D7 chord. And depending on the key signature, there might be an F sharp or something. But you can figure out where that chord member is based on the figuration that's underneath it, if you're still feeling that you have some catching up to do with figured bass. Now, there are some modifications to the figures. You can have accidentals appearing in front of them. Or you can just have an accidental hanging out there, and you might be wondering, well, what do I do with that? In general, if you see an accidental, you apply it to the number that it's next to. So if there's a flat with a 6 next to it, then you're going to do a sixth above the bass and lower it a half step. Where this can get confusing is if there's no number next to it. Just remember that the third was so common that it was so frequently left off. If you see an accidental symbol and there's no number next to it, that means that it's applied to the third of the chord. So let's go through these. The flat with no number designation denotes lowering the third above the bass by a half step. When it occurs next to a number, it indicates that the interval above the bass should be lowered a half step. If you see a natural with no number designation, this denotes the negation of whatever key signature or any other accidentals in that measure. And if it's with no number, it applies to the third. When it occurs next to a number, you apply that natural to the specified interval. Likewise, a sharp with no number designates raising the third above the base by a half step. When it occurs next to a number, you raise that interval by a half step. Now, this is the part that many people forget, and that's the slash. The slash was just the shortcut way to write a sharp. So if you see a slash through a number, that means to raise it one half step. Again, that's something that people frequently forget. So just remember, a slash raises that a half step. Sometimes you'll see additional figures, particularly you'll see additional numbers. So if you see a dash next to a figure, and underneath an immediately adjacent note, implies the pitch should be held in the voice in which it currently occurs. For instance, in that Mozart example we were looking at, the 7 and the sharp above the first eighth notes imply that 2 of the 3 pitches of an E major minor 7th chord should be held through. Now, if you see a number and then a dash and another number, this implies specific voice leading. So whatever part has that first interval should voice lead to that next interval. The most common of these that you'll see is often 4-3, or like we saw in the Mozart example, it was just a 4 to a sharp. Remember that a sharp with no number next to it just implies a third. So in the Mozart example, and you can go back and look at it in the video, it had a 4 and a sharp over an E. And that was implying that the voice that stated the fourth above the E, or the A, should move to the G sharp, the sharp third above the E. So it's implying a specific voice leading practice. And we'd probably want to cadence there. So to recap, a figured bass is a bass line under which numbers appear, implying the harmonies that are sounding above. These harmonies would be played by a chordal instrument, like a harpsichord, lute, organ, or theorbo. Meanwhile, the bass line would also be doubled in a resounding instrument like a cello or gamba. Numbers would indicate the intervals above the bass line that should be sounded along with the bass line. We interpret those as chords, and we use Roman numerals to analyze those. Back in the Baroque era, those wouldn't have been used. Accidentals like flats, naturals, sharps, and slashes would be added for chromatic modifications. And dashes would be used to indicate that the voice performing a particular interval should resolve to another specific interval.